Hello, my name is Ben Green. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a huge freaking nerd. And that's what we're here to talk about today. I want to take a second to talk about what queer books mean to me and what queer writing has done for me. I was always a reader for a long time, was a big Percy Jackson kid, was a big She Who Should Not Be Named kind of kid. I was in that. I loved reading. And then, like a lot of people, high school English and college homework killed my love of reading for a while. And then I transitioned. I became a speaker and an advocate, and I knew that I loved books, but I wanted to get back into it, but I didn't know what was possible. And so in 2020, I just moved to St. Louis. I had very little community. I didn't know what was out there in the world around me. And my family, as a birthday present, got me a private browsing session at what I now know to be a popular queer bookstore in St. Louis called Left Bank Books. And I went into the bookstore, and there were five people in my whole browsing appointment. And the other four people went in, bought their books, and bugged out. And I had an additional 90 minutes booked in the store with me and the booksellers. And so I was spent the whole time working out my courage, and then I went out to the front desk and I said, "Hi, I know this might be a weird question, but is there such a thing as a science fiction or fantasy book that has a trans protagonist? Does that exist?" And I was so nervous, and the person that was at the front desk started to kind of chuckle and laugh in a vaguely TV supervillain kind of way. And I was like, "I'm sorry, you can forget that I asked." And she was like, "Buddy, everyone who works here is trans." And so then my friend Danielle and the other three booksellers who were there brought me down to the basement, which is where they keep the science fiction and fantasy, sat me down in a chair, and proceeded to spend the next 90 minutes giving me a mind-boggling education in the world of queer and trans science fiction and fantasy. They sat me down, they piled me up with stacks and stacks and stacks, literally running around the store, running up to me being like, "Ben, here's this one. Okay, the next person. Okay, here's this one. And this book is gay people in space. And this is gay cowboys. And this is transgender romance." And it was so chaotic. And I went home and I read all of them. And I was like, oh my God. I didn't know they put us into books. This is unbelievable. And so I started connecting to my own identity. I started connecting to my community. I fell in love with reading and with writing and with queer books. And so now I write queer fantasy books as well as queer and trans nonfiction books. I've found so much of myself and my home and my community through that bookstore and that moment. And that's the experience that I want to replicate with you all today. Queer books taught me how to build the world that I want to live in. And they taught me that I was not alone in it. And so I want everyone to get to experience that feeling. What queer science fiction teaches us about survival. There's a quote from Octavia Butler, one of the most pioneering liberatory authors of this universe. She said, "I never bought into my invisibility or non-existence as a Black person. As a female and as an African American, I wrote myself into the world. I wrote myself into the present, the future, and the past." And that's what we're talking about when we talk about queer science fiction. And there's plenty of things in the queer fantasy world as well. Today's conversation is going to be a lot about sci-fi and speculative fiction, which is this imagining. And I think no one could say it better than Miss Octavia Butler, which is that we are using science fiction to imagine a world that is better, to understand the role that we play in the world we're in now, and to recognize where we've come from. Queer books allow us to see a future with ourselves in it. When I got to that bookstore for the first time, I wasn't just struggling with making friends in my community or figuring out what job I wanted to do in a new city. I was struggling on a much more fundamental level to imagine such a thing as a future with me in it. That was a skill as a trans person that I did not really have. So queer characters in these science fiction and fantasy stories do a couple of things. Sometimes people read sci-fi, speculative, and fantasy books because we want an escape from the real world stressors that we have. And when we include queer characters in those escapes, we remind ourselves that we're not trying to escape from our queerness, right? My queerness isn't a problem. I love being trans. My life is not worse because I'm trans. My life is worse because of politicians who hate that I'm trans. I want to escape them, but I don't need to escape myself. So being able to bring our whole selves into this joyful escape, and then seeing normalized diversity reminds us that things aren't supposed to be this way, right? One of the things I love the most about science fiction is how frequent it is to have totally radically different norms around gender and sexuality. And it's almost a trope in science fiction for conventional gender roles to be like a joke, to be like, oh, it's so weird. You know, when we encounter aliens, they love to say, like, sorry, and you're saying that all the girls wear pink? That is so weird. Um, that normalized diversity, where when we think of the future, we think of the future as synonymous with radical acceptance and normalization of queerness and gender fluidity and openness, that does amazing things to our brain. To understand that we are walking towards a world where one day this is not an issue. This is totally normal. That's how things can be. And seeing ourselves in those stories, even just as background characters or messy characters, or even complicated or evil or angry or pained characters, is an amazing way to normalize our view of ourselves in the world around us. So, if we're thinking about imagining the future, it would be impossible not to start at one of the themes that dominates science fiction, which is dystopia and revolution fiction. There are so many, if not infinite, books about total dystopia, about total societal overthrow or societal collapse. And one of the things I love about the queer approaches to books about dramatic change and total collapse or changes that take place over centuries is that they remind us how many different forms that change is going to take and what it's going to look like. And they portray them in ways that's really messy and remind us that it's not just going to be, you know, an easy, quick, perfect switch. And these stories also include regular human stories of people living their lives, people having hobbies, people building families, people falling in love, reminding ourselves that while it might feel like everything around us is falling apart, and I know that's sometimes how it feels right now, we also will continue to live. And so a lot of these books, some of my favorites are Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin and the Broken Earth trilogy, A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine, Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. That's a really neat one that not enough people have heard of. That is essentially this giant spaceship that has recreated the social statuses of the antebellum South. And someone decides to start, after a really terrible incident with a guard keeper, starts a revolution in the kind of bowels of this spaceship. The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin is also a really beautiful, deeply messy book about the kind of what comes next. It takes place about 170 years after a successful revolution where a group of anarchists have built their ideal world on a desolate moon, and ask questions like, in a completely egalitarian and equal society, what is the place for somebody who is brilliant or exceptional? What is the place for academic study? How do people handle relationships and marriage? And there's a line in that book that I really love that said, you cannot buy the revolution, you cannot make the revolution, you can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit or it is nowhere. I just finished reading that book actually last night, so it's very present in my heart. And Ursula K. Le Guin, who we're going to talk about again in this presentation, is one of the leading authors in writing us towards a better future and envisioning for decades. The Dispossessed came out over 50 years ago. For decades, she wrote about what could the future look like in really radical ways.